The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 4, Side 1. Lest we misrepresent Sidonius, we must add that he was a good Christian and a brave bishop. In 469, unexpectedly and unwillingly, he found himself precipitated from lay status to the episcopacy of Clermont. A bishop in those days had to be a civil administrator as well as a spiritual guide, and men of experience and wealth, like Ambrose and Sidonius, had qualifications that proved more effective than theological erudition. Having little of such learning, Sidonius had few anathemas to bestow. Instead, he gave his silver plate to the poor and forgave sins with an alarming readiness. From one of his letters we perceive that the prayers of his flock were sometimes interrupted by refreshments. Reality broke into this pleasant life when Uric, king of the Visigoths, decided to annex Auvergne. Each summer, for 4 years, the Goths laid siege to Clermont, its capital. Sidonius fought them with diplomacy and prayer, but failed. When at last the city fell, he was taken captive and was imprisoned in a fortress near Carcassonne in 475. 2 years later he was released and restored to his see. How long he survived we do not know, but already at 45 he wished to be delivered from the pains and burdens of present life by a holy death. He had lost faith in the Roman Empire and now put all his hopes for civilization in the Roman Church. The Church forgave him his half-pagan poetry and made him a saint. 2. The Franks, 240 to 511. With the death of Sidonius, the night of barbarism closed down upon Gaul. We must not exaggerate that darkness. Men still retained economic skills, traded goods, minted coinage, composed poetry, and practiced art. And under Uric, from 466 to 484, and Alaric II, from 484 to 507, the Visigothic kingdom in southwestern Gaul was sufficiently orderly, civilized, and progressive to draw praise from Sidonius himself. In 506, Alaric II issued a breviarium, or summary of laws for his realm. It was a comparatively enlightened code, reducing to rule and reason the relations between the Romano-Gallic population and its conquerors. A like code was enacted in 510 by the Burgundian kings who had peaceably established their people in power in southeastern Gaul. Until the revival of Roman law at Bologna in the 11th century, Latin Europe would be governed by Gothic and Burgundian codes and the kindred laws of the Franks. History picks up the Franks in 240, when the Emperor Aurelian defeated them near Mainz. The Ripuarian Franks, of the Bank, settled early in the 5th century on the west slopes of the Rhine. They captured Cologne in 463, made it their capital, and extended their power in the Rhine valley from Aachen to Metz. Some Frank tribes remained on the east side of the river and gave their name to Franconia. The Salic Franks may have taken their distinguished name from the river Saale, now IJssel in the Netherlands. Thence they moved south and west, and about 356 occupied the region between the Meuse, the ocean, and the Somme. For the most part their spread was by peaceful migration, sometimes by Roman invitation to settle sparsely occupied lands. By these diverse ways northern Gaul had become half Frank by 430. They brought their Germanic language and pagan faith with them, so that during the 5th century Latin ceased to be the speech and Christianity the religion of the peoples along the lower Rhine. The Salic Franks described themselves, in the prologue to their Salic law, as the glorious people, wise in counsel, noble in body, radiant in health, excelling in beauty, daring, quick, hardened. This is the people that shook the cruel yoke of the Romans from its neck. They considered themselves not barbarians, but self-liberated freemen. Frank meant free, and franchised. They were tall and fair, knotted their long hair in a tuft on the head, and let it fall thence like a horse's tail, wore mustaches but no beards, bound their tunics at the waist with leather belts covered with segments of enameled iron. From this belt hung sword and battle-axe, and articles of toilet like scissors and combs. The men as well as the women were fond of jewelry and wore rings, armlets, and beads. Every able-bodied male was a warrior, taught from youth to run, leap, swim, and throw his lance or axe to its mark. Courage was the supreme virtue, for which murder, rapine, and rape might readily be forgiven. But history, by telescoping one dramatic event into the next, leaves a false impression of the Franks as merely warriors. Their conquests and battles were no more numerous and far less extensive and destructive than our own. Their laws show them engaged in agriculture and handicrafts, making northeastern Gaul a prosperous and usually peaceful rural society. The Salic law was formulated early in the 6th century, probably in the same generation that saw Justinian's full development of Roman law. We are told that 4 venerable chieftains wrote it, and that it was examined and approved by 3 successive assemblies of the people. Trial was largely by compurgation and ordeal. A sufficient number of qualified witnesses attesting the good character of a defendant cleared him of any charge of which he was not evidently guilty. The number of witnesses required varied with the enormity of the alleged crime. 72 could free a supposed murderer, but when the chastity of a queen of France was in question, 300 nobles were needed to certify the paternity of her child. If the matter at issue still stood in doubt, the law of ordeal was invoked. The accused, bound hand and foot, might be flung into a river, to sink if innocent, to float if guilty, for the water, having been exorcised by religious ceremony, would reject a sinful person. Or the accused would be made to walk barefoot through fire or over red-hot irons, or to hold a red-hot iron in his hand for a given time, or to plunge a bare arm into boiling water and pluck out an object from the bottom. Or accuser and accused would stand with arms outstretched in the form of a cross until one or the other proclaimed his guilt by letting his arm fall with fatigue. Or the accused would take the consecrated wafer of the Eucharist, and if guilty, would surely be struck down by God. Or trial by combat would decide between 2 freemen when legal evidence still left a reasonable doubt. Some of these ordeals were old in history. The Avesta indicates that the ordeal of boiling water was used by the ancient Persians. The laws of Manu, before A.D. 100, mention Hindu ordeals by submersion, and ordeals by fire or hot irons appear in Sophocles' Antigone. The Semites rejected ordeals as impious. The Romans ignored them as superstitious. The Germans developed them to the full. The Christian Church reluctantly accepted them and surrounded them with religious ceremony and solemn oath. Trial by combat was as old as ordeal. Saxo Grammaticus describes it as compulsory in Denmark in the 1st century A.D. The laws of the Angles, Saxons, Franks, Burgundians, and Lombards indicate its general use among them, and St. Patrick found it in Ireland. When a Roman Christian complained to the Burgundian King Gundobad that such a trial would decide not guilt but skill, the king replied, "Is it not true that the issue of wars and combats is directed by the judgment of God, and that his providence awards the victory to the just cause?" The conversion of the barbarians to Christianity merely changed the name of the deity whose judgments was invoked. We cannot judge or understand these customs unless we put ourselves in the place of men who took it for granted that God entered casually into every event and would not connive at an unjust verdict. With such a dire test to face, accusers uncertain of their case or their evidence would think twice before bothering the courts with their complaints, and guilty defendants would shirk the ordeal and offer compensation in its place. For nearly every crime had its price. The accused or convicted man might usually absolve himself by paying a wergild or man payment, 1/3 to the government, 2/3 to the victim or his family. The sum varied with the social rank of the victim, and an economical criminal had to take many facts into consideration. If a man immodestly stroked the hand of a woman, he was to be fined 15 denarii, or $2.25. If he so stroked her upper arm, he paid 35 denarii, or $5.25. If he touched her unwilling bosom, he paid 45 denarii, or $6.75. This was a tolerable tariff in comparison with other fines. 2,500 denarii, or $375, for the assault and robbery of a Frank by a Roman, 1,400 for the assault and robbery of a Roman by a Frank, 8,000 denarii for killing a Frank, 4,000 for killing a Roman. So low had the mighty Roman fallen in the eyes of his conquerors. If, as not seldom happened, satisfactory compensation was not received by the victim or his relatives, they might take their own revenge. In this way, vendettas might leave a trail of blood through many generations. Wergild and judicial combat were the best expedients that primitive Germans could devise to wean men from vengeance to law. The most famous clause in the Salic law read, "Of Salic land no portion of the inheritance shall go to a woman." On this basis, in the 14th century, France would reject the claim of the English King Edward III to the French throne through his mother Isabel, whereupon would follow the 100 Years' War. The clause applied only to realty, which was presumed to require for its protection the military power of a male. In general, the Salic law did no service to women. It exacted a double wergild for their murder, valuing them as the possible mothers of many men. But, like early Roman law, it kept women under the perpetual wardship of father, husband, or son. It made death the penalty for adultery by the wife, but asked no penalty of the adulterous male. And it permitted divorce at the husband's whim. Custom, if not law, allowed polygamy to the Frank kings. The first Frank king known by name was the Clodio, who attacked Cologne in 431. Aetius defeated him, but Clodio succeeded in occupying Gaul as far west as the Somme and making Tournai his capital. A possibly legendary successor, Moravec, son of the sea, gave his name to the Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Franks till 751. Moravec's son Childeric seduced Basina, wife of a Thuringian king. She went to be his queen, saying she knew no man wiser, stronger, or handsomer. The child of their union was Clovis, who founded France and gave his name to 18 French kings. Clovis inherited the Merovingian throne in 481, aged 15. His realm was then a mere corner of Gaul. Other Frank tribes ruled the Rhineland, and the Visigothic and Burgundian kingdoms in southern Gaul had been made fully independent by the fall of Rome. Northwest Gaul, still nominally under Roman power, was left defenseless. Clovis invaded it, captured towns and dignitaries, accepted ransoms, sold spoils, bought troops, supplies, and arms, advanced to Soissons, and defeated a Roman army in 486. During the next 10 years he extended his conquests till they touched Brittany and the Loire. He won over the Gallic population by leaving them in possession of their lands, and the Orthodox Christian clergy by respecting their creed and their wealth. In 493 he married a Christian, Clotilde, who soon converted him from paganism to Nicene Christianity. Remy, bishop and saint, baptized him at Reims before an audience of prelates and notables judiciously invited from all Gaul, and 3,000 soldiers followed Clovis to the font. Perhaps Clovis, longing to reach the Mediterranean, thought France was worth a mass. The Orthodox population in Visigothic and Burgundian Gaul now looked askance at their Arian rulers and became the secret or open allies of the young Frank king. Alaric II saw the oncoming tide and tried to turn it back with fair words. He invited Clovis to a conference. They met at Amboise and pledged lasting friendship. But Alaric, returning to Toulouse, arrested some Orthodox bishops for conspiring with the Franks. Clovis summoned his martial assembly and said, "I take it very hard that these Arians hold part of Gaul. Let us go with God's help and conquer them." Alaric defended himself as well as he could with a divided people. He was defeated at Vuillet, near Poitiers, in 507, and was slain by Clovis's hand. After Clovis had spent the winter in Bordeaux, says Gregory of Tours, and had taken all the treasures of Alaric from Toulouse, he went to besiege Angoulême, and the Lord gave him such grace that the walls fell down of their own accord. Here, so soon, is the characteristic note of the medieval chronicler. Sigebert, the old king of the Ripuarian Franks, had long been an ally of Clovis. To Sigebert's son, Clovis now suggested the advantages that would come from Sigebert's death. The son killed his father. Clovis sent professions of friendship to the patricide and agents to murder him. This having been attended to, Clovis marched to Cologne and persuaded the Ripuarian chieftains to accept him as their king. Every day, says Gregory, God caused his enemies to fall beneath his hand, because he walked with a right heart before the Lord and did the things that were pleasing in his sight. The conquered Arians were readily converted to the Orthodox faith, and their clergy, by omitting an iota, were allowed to retain their clerical rank. Clovis, rich with captives, slaves, spoils, and benedictions, moved his capital to Paris. There, 4 years later, he died, old at 45. Queen Clotilde, having helped to make Gaul France, came to Tours after the death of her husband and served there in the church of St. Martin, and dwelt in the place with the greatest chastity and kindness all the days of her life. 3. The Merovingians, 511 to 614. Clovis, who had longed for sons, had too many at his death. To avoid a war of succession, he divided his kingdom among them. Childebert received the region of Paris, Clodomer that of Orléans, Clotaire that of Soissons, Theodoric that of Metz and Reims. With barbarian energy, they continued the policy of unification by conquest. They took Thuringia in 530, Burgundy in 534, Provence in 536, Bavaria and Swabia in 555. and Clotaire I, outliving his brothers and inheriting their kingdoms, governed a Gaul vaster than any later France. Dying in 561, he redivided Gaul into three parts. The Reims and Metz region, known as Austrasia, that is the east, went to his son Sigebert. Burgundy to Guntram, and to Kilperic the Soissons region, known as Neustria, that is the northwest. From the day of Clovis's marriage, the history of France has been bisexual, mingling love and war. Sigebert sent costly presents to Athanagild, Visigothic king of Spain, and asked for his daughter Brunhilde. Athanagild, fearing the Franks even when they bore gifts, consented, and Brunhilde came to grace the halls of Metz and Reims in 566. Kilperic was envious. All that he had was a simple wife, Audavira, and a rough concubine, Fredegunda. He asked Athanagild for Brunhilde's sister. Galswintha came to Soissons, and Kilperic loved her, for she had brought great treasures. But she was older than her sister. Kilperic returned to the arms of Fredegunda. Galswintha proposed to go back to Spain. Kilperic had her strangled in 567. Sigebert declared war upon Kilperic and defeated him. But two slaves sent by Fredegunda assassinated Sigebert. Brunhilde was captured, escaped, crowned her young son Childebert II, and ruled ably in his name. Kilperic is described to us as the Nero and Herod of our time, ruthless, murderous, lecherous, gluttonous, greedy for gold. Gregory of Tours, our sole authority for this portrait, partly explains it by making him also the Frederick II of his age. Kilperic, he tells us, scoffed at the idea of three persons in one God, and at the conception of God as like a man, held scandalous discussions with Jews, protested against the wealth of the church and the political activity of the bishops, annulled wills made in favor of churches, sold bishoprics to the highest bidders, and tried to remove Gregory himself from the see of Tours. The poet Fortunatus described the same king as a synthesis of virtues, a just and genial ruler, a Cicero of eloquence, but Kilperic had rewarded Fortunatus's verse. Kilperic was stabbed to death in 584, possibly by an agent of Brunhilde. He left an infant son, Clotaire II, in whose stead Fredegunda ruled Neustria with as much skill, perfidy, and cruelty as any man of the time. She sent a young cleric to kill Brunhilde. When he returned unsuccessful, she had his hands and feet cut off. But these items, too, are from Gregory. Meanwhile, the nobles of Austrasia, encouraged by Clotaire II, raised revolt after revolt against the imperious Brunhilde. She controlled them as well as she could by diplomacy tempered with assassination. Finally, they deposed her, aged 80, tortured her for 3 days, tied her by hair, hand, and foot to the tail of a horse, and lashed the horse to flight. This in 614. Clotaire II inherited all three kingdoms, and the Frank realm was again won. From this red chronicle, we may exaggerate the barbarism that darkened Gaul hardly a century after the urbane and polished Sidonius. Men must find some substitute for elections. The unifying work of Clovis was undone by his descendants, as that of Charlemagne would be, but at least government continued, and not all Gauls could afford the polygamy and brutality of their kings. The apparent autocracy of the monarch was limited by the power of jealous nobles. He rewarded their services in administration and war with estates on which they were practically sovereign. And on these great demesnes began the feudalism that would fight the French monarchy for 1,000 years. Serfdom grew, and slavery received a new lease of life from new wars. Industry passed from the towns to the manors. The towns shrank in size and fell under the control of the feudal lords. Commerce was still active, but hindered by unstable currencies, highway brigandage, and the rise of feudal tolls. Famine and pestilence fought successfully against the eager reproductiveness of men. The Frank chieftains intermarried with what remained of the Gallo-Roman senatorial class and generated the aristocracy of France. It was, in these centuries, a nobility of force, relishing war, scorning letters, proud of its long beards and silken robes, and almost as polygamous as any Moslem save Mohammed. Seldom has an upper class shown such contempt for morality. Conversion to Christianity had no effect upon them. Christianity seemed to them merely an expensive agency of rule and popular pacification. And in the triumph of barbarism and religion, barbarism dominated for 5 centuries. Assassination, patricide, fratricide, torture, mutilation, treachery, adultery, and incest mitigated the boredom of rule. Kilperic, we are told, ordered every joint and sigil of the Goth to be burned with white-hot irons, and each limb to be torn from its socket. Caribert had as mistresses 2 sisters, one a nun. Dagobert, from 628 to 639, had 3 wives at once. Sexual excesses perhaps accounted for the exceptional sterility of the Merovingian kings. Of Clovis's 4 sons, only Clotaire had issue. Of Clotair's 4 sons, only one had a child. The kings married at 15 and were exhausted at 30. Many of them died before the age of 28. By 614, the Merovingian house had spent its energy and was ready to be replaced. Amid this chaos, education barely survived. By 600, literacy had become a luxury of the clergy. Science was almost extinct. Medicine remained, for we hear of court physicians, but among the people magic and prayer seemed better than drugs. Gregory, Bishop of Tours, who lived possibly from 538 to 594, denounced as sinful the use of medicine instead of religion as a means of curing illness. In his own sickness he sent for a physician, but soon dismissed him as ineffectual. Then he drank a glass of water containing dust from St. Martin's tomb, and was completely cured. Gregory himself was the chief prose writer of his time. He knew personally several Merovingian kings, and occasionally served as their emissaries. His History of the Franks is a crude, disorderly, prejudiced, superstitious, and vivid first-hand account of the later Merovingian age. His Latin is corrupt, vigorous, direct. He apologizes for his bad grammar and hopes that sins of grammar will not be punished on Judgment Day. He accepts miracles and prodigies with the trustful imagination of a child or the genial shrewdness of a bishop. We shall mingle together in our tale the miraculous doings of the saints and the slaughters of the nations. In 587, he assures us, snakes fell from the sky, and a village with all its buildings and inhabitants suddenly disappeared. He denounces everything in anyone guilty of unbelief or of injury to the Church, but he accepts without flinching the barbarities, treacheries, and immoralities of the Church's faithful sons. His prejudices are frank and can be easily discounted. The final impression is one of engaging simplicity. After him, the literature of Gaul becomes predominantly religious in content, barbarous in language and form, with one shining exception. Venantius Fortunatus, who lived circa 530 to 610, was born in Italy and educated at Ravenna. At 35, he moved to Gaul, wrote lauds for its bishops and queens, and developed a platonic affection for Radegunda, wife of the first Clotaire. When she founded a convent, Fortunatus became a priest, her chaplain, and finally Bishop of Poitiers. He wrote pretty poems in honor of potentates and saints, 29 to Gregory of Tours, a life of St. Martin in heroic verse, above all some sonorous hymns, of which one, Pange Lingua, inspired Thomas Aquinas to a similar theme and still higher performance, while another, Vexilla Regis, became a lasting part of Catholic liturgy. He mingled feeling admirably with poetic skill. Reading his fresh and genial lines, we discover the existence of kindliness, sincerity, and the tenderest sentiment amid the royal brutalities of the Merovingian age. 4. Visigothic Spain, 456 to 711. In 420, as we have seen, the Visigoths of Gaul recaptured Spain from the Vandals and returned it to Rome. But Rome could not defend it. 18 years later, the Suevi emerged from their hills in the northwest and overran the peninsula. The Visigoths under Theodoric II in 456 and Euric in 466 came down again across the Pyrenees, reconquered most of Spain, and this time kept the country as their own. A Visigothic dynasty ruled Spain thereafter till the coming of the Moors. At Toledo, the new monarchy built a splendid capital and gathered an opulent court. Athanagild, from 564 to 567, and Leovigild, from 568 to 586, were strong rulers who defeated Frank invaders in the north and Byzantine armies in the south. It was the wealth of Athanagild that won for his daughters the privilege of being murdered as Frank queens. In 589, King Recared changed his faith, and that of most Visigoths in Spain, from Arian to Orthodox Christianity. Perhaps he had read the history of Alaric II. The bishops now became the chief support of the monarchy and the chief power in the state. By their superior education and organization, they dominated the nobles who sat with them in the ruling councils of Toledo. And though the king's authority was theoretically absolute, and he chose the bishops, these councils elected him and exacted pledges of policy in advance. Under the guidance of the clergy, a system of laws was promulgated in 634, which was the most competent and least tolerant of all the barbarian codes. It improved procedure by weighing the evidence of witnesses rather than the character certificates of friends. It applied the same laws to Romans and Visigoths alike and established the principle of equality before the law. But it rejected freedom of worship, demanded orthodox Christianity of all inhabitants, and sanctioned a long and bitter persecution of the Spanish Jews. Through the influence of the Church, which retained Latin in her sermons and liturgy, the Visigoths, within a century after their conquest of Spain, forgot their Germanic speech and corrupted the Latin of the peninsula into the masculine power and feminine beauty of the Spanish tongue. Monastic and episcopal schools provided education, mostly ecclesiastical but partly classical, and academies rose at Vaclara, Toledo, Saragossa, and Seville. Poetry was encouraged, drama was denounced as obscene, which it was. The only name surviving from the literature of Gothic Spain is that of Isidore of Seville, circa 560 to 636. An edifying legend tells how a Spanish lad, reproved for mental sluggishness, ran away from home and, tired with wandering, sat down by a well. His eye was caught by the deep furrow in a stone at the edge. A passing maiden explained that the furrow was worn by the attrition of the rope that lowered and raised the bucket. If, said Isidore to himself, by daily use the soft rope could penetrate the stone, surely perseverance could overcome the dullness of my brain. He returned to his father's house and became the learned Bishop of Seville. Actually, we know little of his life. Amid the chores of a conscientious cleric, he found time to write half a dozen books. Perhaps as an aid to memory, he compiled through many years a medley of passages on all subjects from pagan and Christian authors. His friend Braulio, Bishop of Saragossa, urged him to publish these excerpts. Yielding, he transformed them into one of the most influential books of the Middle Ages. 20 books of etymologies or origins, now a volume of 900 octavo pages. It is an encyclopedia, but not alphabetically arranged. It deals successively with grammar, rhetoric, and logic as the trivium, then with arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy as the quadrivium, then with medicine, law, chronology, theology, anatomy, physiology, zoology, cosmography, physical geography, architecture, surveying, mineralogy, agriculture, war, sports, ships, costumes, furniture, domestic utensils. And under each topic it defines and seeks the origin of the basic terms. Man, we learn, is called homo because God made him from the earth, humus. The knees are genua because in the fetus they lie opposite the cheeks, or geni. Isidore was an industrious, if indiscriminate, scholar. He knew considerable Greek, was familiar with Lucretius, rarely mentioned in the Middle Ages, and preserved in extracts many passages of pagan literature that would otherwise have been lost. His work is a farrago of weird etymologies, incredible miracles, fanciful allegorical interpretations of the Scriptures, science and history distorted to prove moral principles, and factual errors that a little observation would have set straight. His book stands as a lasting monument to the ignorance of his time. Of the arts in Visigothic Spain, almost nothing remains. Apparently Toledo, Italica, Cordova, Granada, Merida, and other cities had fine churches, palaces, and public buildings, designed in classic styles, but distinguished by Christian symbols and Byzantine ornament. In the palaces and cathedral of Toledo, according to Arab historians, Arab conquerors found 25 gold and jeweled crowns, an illuminated psalter written upon gold leaf with ink made of melted rubies, tissues inwoven, armor inlaid, swords and daggers studded, vases filled with jewelry, and an emerald table inwrought with silver and gold, one of many costly gifts of the Visigothic rich to their protective church. Under the Visigothic regime, the exploitation of the simple or unfortunate by the clever or the strong continued as under other governmental forms. Princes and prelates united in a majesty of secular or religious ceremonies, taboos, and terrors to subdue the passions and quiet the thoughts of the populace. Property was concentrated in the hands of a few. The great gulf between rich and poor, between Christian and Jew, divided the nation into 3 states. And when the Arabs came, the poor and the Jews connived at overthrow of a monarchy and a church that had ignored their poverty or oppressed their faith. In 708, on the death of the feeble King Witiza, The aristocracy refused the throne to his children, but gave it to Roderick. The sons of Witiza fled to Africa and asked the aid of Moorish chieftains. The Moors made some tentative raids upon the Spanish coast, found Spain divided and almost defenseless, and in 711 came over in fuller force. The armies of Tariq and Roderick joined battle on the shores of Lake Janda in the province of Cadiz. Part of the Visigothic forces went over to the Moors. Roderick disappeared. The victorious Muslims advanced to Seville, Cordova, Toledo. Several towns opened their gates to the invaders. The Arab general Musa established himself in the capital in 713 and announced that Spain now belonged to the Prophet Muhammad and the Caliph of Damascus. 5. Ostrogothic Italy, 493 to 536. 1. Theodoric. When Attila's empire crumbled at his death in 453, the Ostrogoths whom he had subdued regained their independence. The Byzantine emperors paid them to drive other German barbarians westward, rewarded them with Pannonia, and took Theodoric, the 7-year-old son of their king Theodemir, to Constantinople as a hostage for Ostrogothic fidelity. In 11 years at the Byzantine court, Theodoric acquired intelligence without education, absorbed the arts of war and government, but apparently never learned to write. He won the admiration of the emperor Leo I, and when Theodemir died in 475, Leo recognized Theodoric as king of the Ostrogoths. Leo's successor Zeno, fearful that Theodoric might trouble Byzantium, suggested to him the conquest of Italy. Odoacer had formally acknowledged, actually ignored the Eastern emperors. Theodoric, Zeno hoped, might bring Italy back under Byzantine rule. In any case, the two leaders of dangerous tribes would amuse each other while Zeno studied theology. Theodoric liked, some say propounded the idea. As Zeno's Patricius, he led the Ostrogoths, including 20,000 warriors, across the Alps in 488. The Orthodox bishops of Italy, disliking Odoacer's Arianism, supported the Arian invader as representing an almost orthodox emperor. With their help, Theodoric broke Odoacer's sturdy resistance in 5 years of war and persuaded him to a compromise peace. He invited Odoacer and his son to dine with him at Ravenna, fed them generously, and slew them with his own hand in 493. So treacherously began one of the most enlightened reigns in history. A few campaigns brought under Theodoric's rule the Western Balkans, southern Italy, and Sicily. He maintained a formal subordination to Byzantium, struck coins only in the emperor's name, and wrote with due deference to the Senate that still sat in Rome. He took the title of Rex, or king. But this term, once so hateful to Romans, was now generally applied to rulers of regions that acknowledged the sovereignty of Byzantium. He accepted the laws and institutions of the late Western Empire, zealously protected its monuments and forms, and devoted his energy and intelligence to restoring orderly government and economic prosperity among the people whom he had conquered. He confined his Goths to police and military service, and quieted their grumbling with ample pay. Administration and the courts remained in Roman hands. 2/3 of the soil of Italy was left to the Roman population, 1/3 was distributed among the Goths. Even so, not all the arable land was tilled. Theodoric ransomed Roman captives from other nations and settled them as peasant proprietors in Italy. The Pontine marshes were drained and returned to cultivation and health. Believing in a regulated economy, Theodoric issued an edict concerning prices to be maintained at Ravenna. We do not know what prices were decreed. We are told that the cost of food in Theodoric's reign was 1/3 lower than before, but this may have been due less to regulation than to peace. He reduced governmental personnel and salaries, ended state subsidies to the church, and kept taxes low. His revenues, nevertheless, sufficed to repair much of the damage that invaders had done to Rome and Italy, and to erect at Ravenna a modest palace and the churches of Sant'Apollinare and San Vitale. Verona, Pavia, Naples, Spoleto, and other Italian cities recovered under his rule all the architectural splendor of their brightest days. Though an Arian, Theodoric protected the Orthodox Church in her property and worship, and his minister Cassiodorus, a Catholic, phrased in memorable words a policy of religious freedom. "We cannot command religion, for no one can be forced to believe against his will." A Byzantine historian, Procopius, in the following generation, indicted an impartial tribute to the barbarian king. Theodoric was exceedingly careful to observe justice and attained the highest degree of wisdom and manliness. Although in name he was a usurper, yet in fact he was as truly an emperor as any who have distinguished themselves in this office from the beginning of time. Both the Goths and the Romans loved him greatly. When he died, he had not only made himself an object of terror to his enemies, but he also left to his subjects a keen sense of bereavement and loss. 2. Boethius. In this environment of security and peace, Latin literature in Italy had its final fling. Flavius Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus, from possibly 480 to 573, served as secretary to both Odoacer and Theodoric. At the latter's suggestion, he wrote a history of the Goths, which aimed to show supercilious Romans that the Goths, too, had behind them noble ancestors and heroic deeds. Perhaps more objectively, Cassiodorus compiled a chronicon, a chronological history of the world from Adam to Theodoric. At the close of his long political career, he published as Varii a collection of his letters and state papers, some a little absurd, some a bit bombastic, many revealing a high level of morals and statesmanship in the minister and his king. About 540, having seen the ruin and fall of both the governments that he had served, he retired to his estate at Squillace in Calabria, founded 2 monasteries, and lived there as half-monk and half-grandee till his death at the age of 93. He taught his fellow monks to copy manuscripts, pagan as well as Christian, and provided a special room, the scriptorium, for this work. His example was followed in other religious institutions, and much of our modern treasure of ancient literature is the result of the monastic copying initiated by Cassiodorus. In his last years he composed a textbook, Institutiones Divinarum et Humanarum Lectionum, or Course of Religious and Secular Studies, which boldly defended the Christian reading of pagan literature and adopted from Marcianus Capella that division of the scholastic curriculum into trivium and quadrivium, which became the usual arrangement in medieval education. The career of Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, possibly from 475 to 524, paralleled that of Cassiodorus, except in longevity. Both were born of rich Roman families, served Theodoric as ministers, labored to build a bridge between paganism and Christianity, and wrote dreary books that were read and treasured for 1,000 years. Boethius's father was consul in 483. His father-in-law, Symmachus the Younger, was descended from the Symmachus who had fought for the altar of victory. He received the best education that Rome could give, and then spent 18 years in the schools of Athens. Returning to his Italian villas, he buried himself in study. Resolved to save the elements of a classical culture that was visibly dying, he gave his time, the scholar's most grudging gift, to summarizing in lucid Latin the works of Euclid on geometry, of Nicomachus on arithmetic, of Archimedes on mechanics, of Ptolemy on astronomy. His translation of Aristotle's Organon, or logical treatises, and of Porphyry's Introduction to the Categories of Aristotle, provided the leading texts and ideas of the next 7 centuries in logic, and set the stage for the long dispute between realism and nominalism. Boethius tried his hand also at theology. In an essay on the Trinity, he defended the orthodox Christian doctrine and laid down the principle that where faith and reason conflict, faith should prevail. None of these writings repays reading today, but it would be hard to exaggerate their influence on medieval thought. Moved by his family's tradition of public service, Boethius dragged himself from these abstruse pursuits into the whirlpool of political life. He rose rapidly, became consul, then patricius, then master of the offices, that is, prime minister, in 522. He distinguished himself by both his philanthropy and his eloquence. Men compared him with Demosthenes and Cicero. But eminence makes enemies. The Gothic officials at the court resented his sympathy with the Roman and the Catholic population and aroused the suspicions of the king. Theodoric was now 69, failing in health and mind, wondering how to transmit in stability the rule of an Arian Gothic family over a nation 9/10 Roman and 8/10 Catholic. He had reason to believe that both the aristocracy and the church were his foes, who impatiently awaited his death. In 523, Justinian, Byzantine regent, issued an edict banishing all Manichaeans from the empire and barring from civil or military office all pagans and heretics, including all Arians except Goths. Theodoric suspected that the exception was intended to disarm him, but would be withdrawn at the first opportunity, and he judged the decree a poor return for the full liberties that he had accorded to the Orthodox creed in the West. Had he not raised to the highest offices that same Boethius, who had written an anti-Arian tract on the Trinity? In this very year 523 he had given to the Church of St. Peter 2 magnificent chandeliers of solid silver as a gesture of courtesy to the Pope. However, he had offended a great part of the population by protecting the Jews. When mobs destroyed synagogues in Milan, Genoa, and Rome, he had rebuilt the synagogues at public expense. It was in this conjuncture of events that word reached Theodoric of a senatorial conspiracy to depose him. Its leader, he was told, was Albinus, president of the Senate and friend of Boethius. The generous scholar hastened to Theodoric, guaranteed the innocence of Albinus, and said, "If Albinus is a criminal, I and the whole Senate are equally guilty." 3 men of blemished reputation accused Boethius of sharing in the plot, and they adduced a document bearing Boethius's signature, which invited the Byzantine emperor to reconquer Italy. Boethius denied all charges and rejected the document as a forgery. Later, however, he admitted, "Had there been any hopes of liberty, I should have freely indulged them. Had I known of a conspiracy against the king, you would not have known of it from me." He was arrested in 523. Theodoric sought some understanding with the emperor. In words worthy of a philosopher king, he wrote to Justin, "To pretend to dominion over the conscience is to usurp the prerogative of God. By the nature of things, the power of sovereigns is confined to political government. They have no right of punishment except over those who disturb the public peace. The most dangerous heresy is that of a sovereign who separates himself from part of his subjects because they believe not according to his belief." Justin replied that he had a right to refuse office to men whose loyalty he could not trust, and that the order of society required unity of belief. The Arians of the East appealed to Theodoric to protect them. He asked Pope John I to go to Constantinople and intercede for the dismissed Arians. The Pope protested that this was no mission for one pledged to destroy heresy, but Theodoric insisted. John was received with such honors in Constantinople and returned with such empty hands that Theodoric accused him of treason and flung him into jail, where a year later he died. Meanwhile, Albinus and Boethius had been tried before the king, adjudged guilty, and sentenced to death. The frightened Senate passed decrees repudiating them, confiscating their property, and approving the penalty. Symmachus defended his son-in-law and was himself arrested. Boethius, in prison, now composed one of the most famous of medieval books, De Consolatione Philosophiae. In its alternation of undistinguished prose and charming verse, no tear finds voice. There is only a stoic resignation to the unaccountable whims of fortune and an heroic attempt to reconcile the misfortunes of good men with the benevolence, omnipotence, and prescience of God. Boethius reminds himself of all the blessings that life has showered upon him, wealth and a noble father-in-law and a chaste wife and exemplary children. He recalls his dignities and the proud moment when he thrilled with his eloquence a Senate whose presiding consuls were both of them his sons. Such bliss, he tells himself, cannot last forever. Fortune must balance it now and then with a chastening blow, and so much happiness can forgive so fatal a calamity. And yet such recalled felicity can sharpen affliction. In all adversity of fortune, says Boethius in a line that Dante made Francesca echo, it is the most unhappy kind of misfortune to have been happy. He asks Dame Philosophy, whom he personifies in medieval style, where real happiness lies. He discovers that it does not lie in wealth or glory, pleasure or power, and he concludes that there is no true or secure happiness except in union with God. Blessedness is one with divinity. Strangely, there is no suggestion in this book of personal immortality, no reference to Christianity or to any specifically Christian doctrine, no line that might not have been written by Zeno, Epictetus, or Aurelius. The last work of pagan philosophy was written by a Christian who, in the hour of death, remembered Athens rather than Golgotha. On October 23, 524, his executioners came. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.